The hum of flight announcements and the clatter of rolling suitcases echoed through Terminal C of Granger International Airport like a rehearsed melody of controlled chaos, a place where people hurried without looking, scanned without seeing, and moved as though the very ground beneath them dictated urgency. But amidst the flood of travelers moving toward Gate 42 stood a young black woman named Raven Collins, calm, composed, and quietly commanding in her simplicity, wearing a gray Howard, university sweatshirt, dark jeans, and an old leather satchel slung over one shoulder, her presence as unassuming as it was deliberate, and her silence the kind that made people underestimate her, until they didn't. She had arrived at the airport just before sunrise, blending in like any other passenger on her early morning route to Boston. But Raven wasn't here for vacation, nor was she headed home. In fact, she wasn't flying anywhere at all, not really, because her assignment as a federal aviation administration field inspector had nothing to do with reaching a destination, and everything to do with evaluating the journey. The kind no one sees until a single decision sets the whole operation ablaze. And this morning it was Carol Matthews, the senior gate agent with a permanent scowl and an ego forged in years of unchecked authority, who would set the match. Raven stepped forward when her group was called, her boarding pass already loaded on her phone, and her passport in hand. And she gave a polite nod as she approached the counter, only to be met with narrowed eyes and a raised brow from the agent, who didn't say hello, didn't make eye contact, didn't even glance at the boarding group, just stared at Raven's sweatshirt like it personally offended her, then slowly took the passport and held it between two fingers like it might smudge her manicure, flipping it open with exaggerated scrutiny before muttering, "This doesn't look right," loud enough for nearby passengers to turn their heads. Raven remained still, not blinking, not reacting, just allowing a moment to unfold, because her job wasn't to interfere with bias. It was to expose it, document it, and deliver it to the federal board with precision, and Carol was making that very easy. "Do you even have a real ticket?" the agent barked, her voice now rising with manufactured suspicion, and when Raven calmly held out her phone, the agent waved it off and hissed, "Fake ID, fake ticket. You're not going anywhere." And before anyone could speak, before a manager could intervene, before the camera phones began to rise, Carol Matthews took the passport, snapped it in half at the binding, and tossed the pieces on the counter, saying loudly for all to hear, "I've dealt with this before. You people think you can scam your way into a seat." And the terminal fell into shocked silence as the black woman in the Howard sweatshirt finally looked her dead in the eyes and said, without raising her voice, "Ma'am, you just committed a federal offense." And from her satchel, she withdrew a small leather case, flipped it open, and revealed the golden badge of the United States Department of Transportation, FAA Division, Inspector General's Office, full clearance authorization, and a second ID with her real name, rank, and assignment logged into a secure database already tracking employee conduct at major national terminals. And in that instant, the agent who thought she was untouchable went ghost. White. Within 3 minutes, the TSA shift commander was on scene, then airport security, then a representative from the airline's regional HR office who had to be physically pulled out of a meeting to address the sudden detainment of one of their own gate agents. And while Carol stammered and tried to claim she was just doing her job, Raven didn't speak again. She handed her badge to the security lead, asked him to escort her to a private conference room, and requested that a union representative, her FAA liaison, and the gate agent's supervisor meet her there immediately, because this wasn't just about embarrassment. It was about protocol, power, and proof, and Raven had all three. Behind the scenes, the airline's legal department scrambled to identify what had just happened, unaware that Raven's identity had been flagged in advance as a federal compliance check, meaning the entire encounter was already under internal review, with a live digital record streaming directly to FAA headquarters. And when the footage of the ripped passport hit social media, uploaded by a passenger in line, it exploded across platforms within hours, the caption reading, "She tore up her ID, then found out she was a federal inspector." The internet had seen racial profiling before, but never like this. Not against someone who could shut the entire gate down with one sentence. And as Raven sat alone in the interview room waiting for the airline brass to file in, she quietly pieced the broken passport together, lay it flat on the table, and took a single photo, a snapshot of arrogance, assumption, and justice about to be delivered, not with shouting or revenge, but with the cold weight of accountability, that only comes when someone finally sees you and realizes it's already too late. The air inside the conference room was stale and artificially cold, the kind of climate-controlled stillness meant to suppress nerves but incapable of subduing the storm brewing beneath the surface. And Raven Collins sat at the head of the table like she had done countless times before, pen poised, documents spread in crisp military alignment before her. But this time, it wasn't just another compliance inspection or metrics review. This was personal, and the difference showed in the way she didn't blink when the airline's regional operations manager walked in, sweating under his suit despite the chill, followed by the HR director, the terminal supervisor, a representative from the gate agent union, and finally, a visibly shaken Carol Matthews escorted by airport security, her hands trembling slightly, face drawn tight with a cocktail of fear and disbelief that she was no longer in control of the story she thought she had. Author with a few seconds of public humiliation. The moment the door shut, Raven didn't offer greetings or platitudes. She simply said, "This meeting is being recorded and transmitted directly to the FAA Office of Civil Compliance and the Inspector General's Ethics Division." Her voice calm but sharp enough to slice the air in two, and instantly the room shifted. Paper shuffle ceased, coughs died in throats. Eyes darted downward. Because everyone in that room knew this wasn't just a personnel incident anymore. It was a federal event, and the woman in the Howard sweatshirt had more power in her silence than any of them could muster with a boardroom full of excuses. "Please confirm your names and roles for the record," she continued, and one by one they spoke, until finally Carol's voice cracked across the table. Carol Matthews, Senior Gate Agent, and her title sounded hollow now, deflated in the presence of someone she had tried to reduce to nothing with one cruel act. Raven began by reading aloud the official policy from the FAA handbook outlining gate-level conduct, anti-discrimination clauses, and the strict federal penalties associated with interfering with a passenger's lawful travel using federal identification. Each point punctuated with references to Carol's actions, not just the tearing of the passport, but the verbal accusations, the racial implications, and the refusal to follow standard secondary ID verification procedures, which Raven had deliberately triggered to test compliance under pressure, and which Carol had failed in under 30 seconds. As Raven played the terminal security footage on her laptop, a silent loop of Carol's hand snapping the passport, her lips mouthing "you people," while passengers looked on in horror. The airline HR director turned pale, the operations manager dropped his pen, and Carol buried her face in her hands. Her earlier arrogance, now replaced by the slow, crushing realization that her career had not only ended in one instant, but had done so in front of the wrong woman. "You were selected at random as part of federal conduct sweep," Raven explained, still composed, still merciless. "Your failure was documented in real time. The Department of Transportation will be issuing a formal notice of investigation, and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has been notified of possible Title VI violations." And Carol looked up, tears pooling now as she whispered, "I didn't know." But Raven cut her off, not with cruelty, but with finality. "That's the point. You didn't inquire. You assumed. You evaluated. You acted. And now the consequences belong to you." For the next 20 minutes, Raven walked the full report, her tone never rising, her words never rushed, because power, real power, didn't shout. It simply moved like steel beneath silk. And by the time she stood to leave, the room was silent. Every executive fully aware that the headlines had already begun, that the FAA would be launching a full audit of the airline's gate operations, that union protections wouldn't shield deliberate misconduct from federal prosecution, and that the quiet woman they tried to label a liar was the one holding the keys to their survival. As Raven stepped into the hallway, her phone buzzed, a text from HQ reading, "Full support. Press request pending. We've got your back." And as she made her way toward the terminal exit, dozens of passengers waiting nearby stood up, not because they knew who she was, but because they had seen what happened, and someone had whispered the truth. "That's her, the inspector." She didn't speak, didn't nod, just walked through them with grace and calm. And somewhere behind her, Carol Matthews sat weeping in a cold room she thought she'd never have to answer for, until the day she tore the wrong woman's passport in half and met the kind of justice that never has to raise its voice to be heard. By morning, Raven Collins' name was trending in every major headline. Not because she wanted it to be, but because the story had ignited something raw and long suppressed in the Collective conscience of a country tired of watching professionalism used as a mask for prejudice. Black FAA inspector has passport torn by gate agent. Power trip meets accountability. You people backfire spectacularly. The phrases burn across social media feeds, while news anchors try to frame the story carefully, interviewing experts who confirm what Raven had known all along. The racial profiling she faced wasn't an isolated incident. It was the tip of an iceberg buried under years of polite denial and hollow training modules that never addressed the root of the rot. But while the public roared in defense of her, Raven stayed quiet, ignoring calls from producers, declining offers from high-profile attorneys, and politely rejecting a sit-down on primetime television because she knew this was never about fame or revenge. It was about exposing a mechanism and forcing to account for the gears grinding silently beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the airline scrambled to contain the fallout, issuing a vague statement of apology that Raven immediately called out as an exercise in public relations, not responsibility. And when the CEO attempted to schedule a closed-door meeting with her to discuss potential paths forward, she responded with a simple email. The only path forward is through. At FAA headquarters in D.C., the walls of her department were abuzz with pride and fury alike. Colleagues walking past her desk with subtle nods of respect, brass stepping in to quietly ask if she needed personal security after threats began surfacing from fringe trolls who twisted the story into some absurd anti-government conspiracy. And yet, Raven didn't flinch, not because she wasn't affected, but because she was trained to lead under pressure, to investigate under fire, and to rise without permission. While the public debated and the airline reeled, the federal response was methodical. Within 72 hours, a formal investigation into the airline's gate practices began, auditing years of traveler complaints, flagging patterns of behavior at multiple hubs, and opening the door to a class action review that could cost the company millions if mishandling or discrimination were proven systemic. Meanwhile, Carol Matthews, suspended indefinitely and facing the possibility of federal charges for destruction of travel documents and civil rights violations, tried to issue a public apology through a local reporter, an awkward, trembling attempt to reframe herself as a frustrated employee under stress. But the video was met with fierce backlash, and worse, her former colleagues began to distance themselves as more testimonies poured in from other black and brown travelers who had quietly endured her behavior for years, their stories now unburdened by Raven's example. In response, Raven drafted a formal memorandum to the Department of Transportation outlining policy revisions she believed necessary, not just more training, but independent monitoring, unannounced inspections, and an overhaul of the complaint resolution process that had too long favored corporations over civilians. And when she hand-delivered it during a closed-session oversight committee meeting, her words echoed through the room. Passengers should never need a badge to be believed. Outside the political corridors, everyday people sent letters, grandmothers who'd been humiliated by TSA, teenagers who watched their parents spoken to like criminals, even employees within the airline industry who confessed they'd feared speaking out. Hundreds of letters, each one a reminder that Raven hadn't just exposed a moment. She'd shattered a wall of silence, and in doing so, forced the world to look at itself through her unblinking lens. On the Friday following the incident, she returned to Granger International, not in disguise, not in silence, but invited by a new task force to begin evaluating internal reforms. And as she passed through the very gate where it all began, the terminal went quiet once again, not from fear, but from reverence, and one young black girl traveler with her father pointed and whispered, "That's her," to which the father replied, "That's not just her. That's how change walks in." It was never Raven Collins' intention to become a symbol, but in the weeks that followed the incident at Gate 42, that's exactly what she became. Not because she campaigned for attention or basked in the spotlight, but because her unwavering calm, her refusal to lash out or retreat, and her precise, surgical exposure of systemic arrogance struck a chord with millions who had long accepted that public spaces could become battlegrounds the moment someone in a uniform decided they weren't worth respect. The FAA's investigation concluded with a 176-page report that left no room for ambiguity. Carol Matthews had violated protocol, federal non-discrimination policy, and basic standards of human decency, and while she narrowly avoided prosecution after accepting a lifetime ban from airline employment and completing a mandated civil rights education program, Her name became synonymous with exactly the kind of institutional failure Raven had spent her career trying to identify before it: damaged lives. But the real victory wasn't in Carol's fall. It was in what rose afterward. The creation of a first-of-its-kind civilian-led oversight board within the FAA's Public Compliance Division, built from Raven's original policy recommendations, and staffed not just by federal appointees, but by frequent travelers, veterans, people with disabilities, and former airline employees who had seen the system from both sides. Raven was asked to lead it, and though she hesitated, fearing the administrative side of things would dull her investigative instincts, she accepted with one condition: that she remain field active, able to perform unannounced inspections, travel undercover, and keep her boots on the ground where truth is often clearest. The board's first directive was named the Collins Protocol, a framework that required all gate agents at regulated airports to undergo immersive anti-bias training, led by former victims of discrimination, and required their annual certification to be linked to direct civilian feedback through encrypted survey tools. Change has swept through the airline industry, not because CEOs had an epiphany, but because the public did, and the cost of doing nothing now had a name, a story, and a precedent. Meanwhile, Raven's photo had become iconic, standing in her sweatshirt, badge in hand, eyes unwavering. A new kind of American portrait that now hung framed in Howard University's Hall of Influence beside judges, scientists, and war heroes. And though she humbly deflected the praise, she visited the campus on quiet weekends to mentor first-generation aviation students who saw in her not just a trailblazer, but a warning that excellence without power still left you vulnerable. At a keynote address at the National Transportation Safety Forum, Raven closed her speech with a line that will be quoted across newsrooms for weeks. Dignity doesn't wear a uniform, and discrimination doesn't always shout, but it's our job to listen anyway, especially when it comes quietly with a badge and a smile. And even the toughest critics stood to applaud, knowing that her message was no longer one of confrontation, but of reconstruction. In private, Raven remained her usual self, measured, observant, fiercely independent. But now, when she passed through an airport, gate agents stood straighter, supervisors whispered into radios, and strangers nodded with respect, not because they feared her badge, but because they knew she'd earned every inch of it, and because in the chaos of terminals and the noise of the travel industry, she had become something almost mythical. The woman who brought the whole system to a halt, not with rage, not with revenge, but with the calm authority of someone who never needed to raise her voice to change the course of everything. 6 months after the morning that changed everything, Raven Collins sat alone in a quiet airport cafe overlooking the tarmac of Reagan National, sipping black coffee and watching a long line of jets taxi across the runway like silent vessels of untold stories, each one carrying passengers with hopes, fears, and assumptions, just like she had once been mistaken for someone who didn't belong, and just like she'd chosen, on that day, not to shrink into invisibility, but to hold her ground with a badge, a voice, and the steady weight of truth. Since then, airports have become a different kind of battleground, not one of confrontation, but of quiet evolution, where gate agents now look passengers in the eye, where you people have been replaced by "how can I help?" and where the memory of one torn passport now shaped the training of tens of thousands. The Collins Protocol was now law in every FAA-funded airport in the country, and Raven had personally overseen the first year of implementation, balancing field audits with Senate committee briefings, walking corridors of policy where language and law danced precariously around intention, and cutting through it all with the same clarity she used in that terminal confrontation. She'd become a fixture in D.C., not in the sense of celebrity or status, but as a name people drop when discussing reform that actually worked, as someone who had crossed a line from quiet operator to national example without ever seeking the stage. But for Raven, the legacy wasn't measured in news segments or policy victories. It was in the letters she still received weekly, from a Nigerian grandmother whose grandson was no longer randomly selected every time he flew, from a Muslim pilot who said the gate staff now greeted her with respect instead of suspicion, from a teenage girl who said she wanted to join the FAA just to be like Ms. Raven Collins. And those letters were kept in a shoebox in her apartment, folded neatly, reread often, and protected more fiercely than any of her awards or medals. And yet, even as progress rippled outward, Raven remained vigilant. Because bias doesn't vanish, it mutates. And one quiet afternoon, while conducting an unannounced compliance test in a small Midwestern airport, she watched as a young Hispanic man in a hoodie was pulled aside for unusual behavior, simply for looking nervous, and her body tensed, not in rage, but in readiness, because this was a work, this was the mission, not just to strike down the big moments that made headlines, but to quietly show up in the small ones no one would ever tweet about, and remind the world that dignity travels in silence, too. Later that night, back at her hotel, she wrote her final memo of the year to the Department of Transportation, ending with one line that would find its way into official policy briefs and future inspector training modules for years to come. The most dangerous thing you can do to someone in uniform or out of it is assume. And somewhere far from headlines, far from recognition, a new recruit read those words in orientation and sat up straighter, realizing that their badge wasn't just a credential. It was a promise to look harder, listen better, and never let anyone confuse silence with weakness again. Raven Collins closed her laptop and looked out the rain-stained window at the city lights. She knew her work wasn't done, but for the first time, she felt like the weight wasn't just hers to carry.